Sally Quinn, on January the 19th of this year, you wrote, "When I started On Faith over 7 years ago, I was an atheist." Let me stop there and ask you, why did you start it, and why did you start with, this wasn't your first column or anything, but why do you say you were an atheist?
I have been an atheist most of my life, and I became an atheist when I was about 4. I had always been taught to say my prayers. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. But my father was in the military, and he was in Germany during World War II, and he liberated Dachau. And he had the staff photographer take photographs of these Holocaust victims. And he made scrapbooks out of them, which are now at the Holocaust Museum. And he brought them home. And I looked at these photographs, and I thought, there can't be a God, because how could a God let this happen? And that's when I stopped believing in God. And I didn't even know the word atheist. I just knew that I didn't believe in God. And then I learned the word atheist when I was 13. I announced to my father that I was an atheist, and he went completely crazy. But even on his deathbed, and I was with him when he died, and one of the last things he said to me is, "Please don't be an atheist." But you know, I could never explain to him. I mean, he was there. He saw what happened at Dachau, but he couldn't understand how I could not believe in a God. But when I took over On Faith, when I started On Faith, I had absolutely no particular faith or beliefs, or I was pretty much an angry atheist, actually. I mean, I was really mad at God, even though I didn't believe in God. But I was really mad that this person, this thing, this idea that people worshipped could create so much suffering on earth. And by the way, as of today, I have still yet to hear anybody who is religious explain to me in a way that makes sense why there is suffering on earth if there's a God, if there's an all-powerful, all-knowing God. How could there possibly, all-loving God, how could there possibly be suffering? So that's always been a problem for me. But John Meacham, who is a great friend of mine, a religion scholar, and I have had many debates about this. And about the time that I started the website, Meacham and I were talking, we were having lunch, and he was saying, you know, you're really not an atheist. And I said, oh, yes, I really am. And sort of at the end of 3 hours, he said, I'll tell you why you're not an atheist, because you are not a negative person. And being an atheist is negative. It's you're against something. You don't believe in something. It's not a positive thing. And he said, also, you know absolutely nothing about religion. Now, if you're going to call yourself an atheist, then you should go out and learn something about religion, become a religion scholar, and then you can come back at it and say, okay, I read all this, I know, you know, and I'm an atheist. Then I would respect your position more. And so about that time, you know, I've always been really interested in religion, because it was so clear to me that there are all these people out there who 95% of the people on this planet believe in something, in God. Their lives are completely, you know, informed by what they believe. And a lot of really intelligent people I know are believers as well. So I couldn't dismiss that. And also, it became clear to me that what was going on in the world, not only in politics, national politics, but also foreign policy, so much of that was about religion. And so I wrote an email to our editor then and said, you know, we really need to cover this. But I was looking at it as a journalist. We're just not covering the story. This is a great story. And so he wasn't interested, and then I went to Don Graham. I had lunch with Don, who was then the owner of the Post, and I said, we're not covering religion. He said, okay, you start a website then. And I said, Don, I don't know anything about religion. I don't know anything about the web. I can barely do my email. And he said, well, nobody's perfect, you know, you do it. So I called up John Meacham, and ask him if he was editor of Newsweek at the time, and I said, will you do this with me? Because I had no street cred, in that. So we got a bunch of people to agree to be panelists, and we started the site 8 years ago. And then I began to study religion. I took a trip around the world about 6 or 8 months after I started the site, called The Great Faiths. And we went to 13 countries and studied every possible religion you can imagine. It was a 3-week trip, totally exhausting. But I was absolutely riveted by what I learned, and I realized that I didn't know anything. That was the first thing that I realized, which was really helpful. And now, 8 years later, I really know that I don't know anything about religion. The more I learn about it, the more I study about it, the more I realize I haven't even begun to understand. But I decided then that I was no longer an atheist after I had studied religion, because I thought Meacham is right. I now understand what people are after. But I also I saw things in religion that were really good. And I had always, my position as an angry atheist which was, religion is the cause of all evil. And obviously that's true on some level. Religion is the cause of a lot of evil. I mean, we look at ISIS today and we see that that's the cause of a lot of evil, and other religions too. But I also began to separate out institutional religion from spirituality or belief. And that was a really important time for me. And I'm not alone, by the way. About 25% of the population now would call themselves spiritual but not religious, SBNRs, what I call SBNRs. And so actually Sam Harris has just written a book called Spirituality Without Religion. That there is something there. There's a Dutch movement called the Somethingists, which actually describes my religious beliefs better than anything else. They believe that there's something there, but they don't know what it is. And so I think I'm a somethingist. I believe that there is something there, and I can call it God if I want to, or I can call it whatever. But I believe that there's something bigger than we are. I believe that we were created by something. And I don't have a personal relationship with God. And I don't really believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. I believe that Jesus Christ was a great man. But I have felt and have been in the presence of the transcendent too many times not to feel that there is something there. And so I don't really pray, but I meditate.
Your labyrinth. First of all, what is a labyrinth?
Well, a labyrinth is not a maze, actually. It's a round, flat surface that's shaped. It looks like a maze, but in fact, when you walk the path of the labyrinth, which is supposedly the circuits of the brain, you walk the path of the labyrinth, it leads you into a circle, and in the center of the circle is when you meditate, where you meditate. And when you walk into the labyrinth, you think of something, you concentrate on something, an issue, something that's bothering you, that worries you, or something where you need clarity, and that's what I find I get from the labyrinth.
So has anybody said to you, or either behind your back, Sally's lost it? I mean, you know what I'm talking about? They see the spiritualism, they say, oh, that's not really religion, and what's she doing? Used to be a hard-bitten style section writer here in town, or that was The View. What's your reaction to that?
Well, actually, the person who was most surprised was my husband.
You say in this column I wrote that he is religious.
He is. He believes in God, but he doesn't. He doesn't go to church. I mean, he's not practicing. But in really scary moments he has prayed. When our son Quinn, we thought was dying, when he'd had heart surgery, Ben went and prayed in church. I tried to pray at the Children's Hospital, the chapel, and I just went in there and nothing happened. Nothing happened. I just got no solace, no nothing.
But something does happen on the labyrinth.
Yes, it's interesting. Yeah, and sometimes it's transcendent. And you're supposed to follow, as I said, the circuits of the brain. And so, but there's something that happens when I walk the labyrinth. You know, they have them in hospitals now and outside of churches everywhere in the country. And there's something very peaceful and soothing and quieting about it. But I never walk the labyrinth that I don't come away with some sense of clarity or understanding about what it is that I'm going through, some issue that I'm going through, or something that I need to work out. I mean, it doesn't always solve the problem, but I always feel that there's something guiding me.
When did you, what happened when you said, besides the story you told about religion, what happened that all of a sudden you wanted to leave this other kind of reporting and go to religion?
Well, it was mainly, I had sort of done it, Brian. I've been there, done that. I'd written all the profiles I wanted to write. I just felt like I was sort of spinning my wheels. I was doing the same kind of thing all the time. And, I actually got off on a tangent about terrorism after 9/11. I did an awful lot of Homeland Security stuff, and that was fascinating to me. I did that for about a year and a half. But it was clear I wanted to move in another direction. I just didn't want to do what I'd been doing. I didn't want to really cover politics anymore. I was interested in politics, but that's not what I wanted to write about.
I want to connect all this to politics, the religious part of it. Here's a clip of the Dalai Lama just recently on the floor of the Senate giving the prayer and then walking around. Let's just watch this and you connect this for us and what it means.
This is my favorite prayer. Daily I pray this. That gives me inner strength. So enthusiasm to serve sentient being, humanity on this one. As long as space remains, and as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain and help dispel the misery of the world. Thank you.
Harry Reid brought him down to the floor, and you'll see here that he walks around and they introduce it. What role does this, you think, really play? How much of this is show in politics and how much of it's real?
I think a lot of that is show. The Dalai Lama, I've met him several times, and he is a very gentle, sweet man. And I think that he would probably be much happier somewhere in a cave meditating. And that's, I think, where he should be. And I'm afraid that sometimes he's being exploited by being dragged around and sort of having to do this fight for Tibet thing. I mean, Tibet, there is no more Tibet. Tibet is over, and that's not happening. And so I think that, all these places he goes and he sits out and talks to people, and he's very difficult to understand. So most of the time people don't understand what he's saying. And, his message is wonderful, which is love and peace and all of that. But, I just feel that he's being used, and that people not only use him, but they use him for their own benefit. So I'm not particularly moved by that. I also have a problem with, I care very deeply about the separation of church and state. And so, I have a problem with words like God being used in the Pledge of Allegiance, or being used when you're swearing in somebody in the military or whatever. I just don't think that has a place in our country now because of religious freedom and because there's so many people who are not religious. It just seems to me that we're no longer a Christian nation. And it seems to me, and we're not necessarily a religious nation. I mean, a lot of people are very religious, but there are an awful lot of people who are, again, it's the same ratio between those who are religious and not, about 25% are people call themselves nuns, N-O-N-E-S, which means if you're asked, what is your faith, you say none. It doesn't mean that they are spiritual. You know, most people who say they're nuns are people who believe in God or believe in something, believe that there is some higher power. Only about 3 or 4% of people are really hardcore atheists. And even sometimes atheists will say they believe in God.
Why do politicians always close their speeches with God bless America?
They have to. They have to, because, you know, the majority of people in this country believe in God, or at least they say they do. And that has become kind of a it's become a way of a code word for saying I'm a good person. And I mean, I have some very close friends who are atheists, who are probably some of the most decent human beings I've ever known in my life, believing in God. And we've seen this from an awful lot of people who believe in God and do terrible things. Believing in God has nothing to do with goodness, nothing. Or integrity, or decency, or values, or morals. You don't need to believe in God to have morals or values. But in this country, we think that we do. And so politicians are smart enough to know that they have to say that. It's just a ritual. But it means nothing. Most of them, I think, don't even think about it, or a lot of them aren't religious. But you can't run for office in this country without saying that you're religious, and you probably ought to be a Christian too. And so, you know, I think that we have a black president, we'll have a woman president, we'll have a Jewish president, we'll have a Muslim president, we'll have a gay president before we ever have an atheist president, because I just think it's too scary for a lot of people to even contemplate. Although I think that the religious four horsemen, you know, Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and Sam Harris, have done a lot to dispel the myth of the evil atheist. They've made it acceptable for people to say that they don't believe in God. But Joe Lieberman was Jewish, but I think, you know, Joe is an Orthodox Jew, and so he was a practicing, and you know, he's part of the Abrahamic faiths, and people respected his religiosity, or well, I should probably say his religious faith, his religious nature, and so I think that was not necessarily a detriment for him, because he was religious and talked about how important his religion was to him.
How often do you write?
Try to write once a week, sometimes twice a week. I mean, once every 2 weeks. And I write from my website on faith, and then that will run in the Washington Post on the religion page. And then occasionally I'll do something that's not about religion, that just strikes me as something I want to write about.
And it's on the website, and if people want to read you, how do they find it?
They go to On Faith. They Google On Faith.
Just On Faith?
Yeah. faithstreet.com/onfaith.
I want to go back. I remember that I have a piece here that you wrote in 1974. And what I want you to do is compare this town with what it was then and what it is now. And this is a piece you did on somebody named Steve Martindale.
Yes.
Been dead for years. When you did a piece on him, he was 30 years old, and he died 16 years later of AIDS. Who was he, and why did this piece, our audience, most of them haven't read it. It was a huge piece. I mean, it went on you had 2 full big pages of it. But it had a real impact on the city, and what were you trying to do?
Well, Steve Martindale actually was a very sweet guy. What I was trying to do was show how you make it in Washington, how you make it socially. And Steve was this rocket, you know. He'd come here right out of college, and by the time he was 30, he was having parties with the most elite, the most famous, the most powerful people in Washington. How did this happen? He was very personable, very friendly. And I liked him. what I wanted to show was how it works. And what Steve did was that he became friends, and he was out everywhere. He started inviting people. He would go out. He would make friends. He would cultivate people. He would flatter people. And then he would start having these, and I still never sure who paid for these parties, but he was able to put on these events. And I think one of the things I said was his trick was to call up Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Teddy Roosevelt's daughter, and say, I'm having a party for Henry Kissinger. And then he would call Henry Kissinger and say, I'm having a party for Alice Roosevelt Longworth. And they would both show up. And everybody knew that if Steve invited them to parties, everyone would be there. And so he became the sort of host with the most in Washington. But it was a fascinating phenomenon to me to see how the power elite could be had so easily in Washington. And you ask how it has changed. Honestly, I don't think that part of it has changed that much in terms of how you succeed. But I think that just having parties in general has become so much more difficult because there is this sort of rancor in Washington. In those days, Republicans and Democrats actually spoke to each other. They were actually friends. And I think a lot of that was because people lived here. Most people on the Hill lived in Washington, and their families lived here. They would go off to their home states and campaign on the weekends or once a month, depending on how far away they lived. And then they would come back here. So they saw each other at dinner, and they saw each other on the weekends, and their kids went to schools together, and they went to church together and synagogue together. And so there was a real sense of community here. And then I once wrote that the airplane was the demise of friendship on Capitol Hill, because once air travel became so much easier, people started traveling. Now most families live outside of Washington, and the members of Congress will fly in on Monday, spend Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday nights on their sofas or live in group houses, and then fly home on Thursday.
So what do you really think of the Post being sold?
Well, I think that Don Graham had no choice but to sell the Washington Post because the Post was losing money, and he sold it to save it. And I think it was just an incredibly courageous thing for him to do.
What's it do to the town that it's now owned by Jeff Bezos? It's also run by a former Reaganite.
Yeah. Well, it was very hard for people at the paper when Don sold it. I mean, everybody was kind of in shock, although we saw it coming because we knew the numbers, and they just couldn't. Better to sell it than to have to fold it, which is the direction it was going. Jeff Bezos bought the paper, and Catherine Weymouth, Don's niece, was publisher until a month ago. And she's now stepping down, and so there are no more Grahams involved. And he's hired Fred Ryan to be the new publisher, who is a former Reaganite, but he's not, he's not a wild-eyed ideologue. He's not. I don't think that Fred Ryan will have any. I don't think he's going to impose himself on the news gathering operation at all. I don't think he will. I think he's going to be someone, and I think he was a good choice because people were nervous about Bezos living in Seattle and not being here. And once the Grahams left, you really did need someone who had been in Washington. Ryan has been here for 20 years. He knows the news business. He has a real respect for the newspaper and the role the newspaper has played. So I think he'll be a great ambassador to Washington.
You felt the power of this town when you wrote these pieces in the Post. Do you still feel the power when you write your religion column? And it's only on the web mostly?
Well, it's so different now because being on the web, I was in television for a while. I was the first network anchor woman in America when I did the CBS Morning News.
Be careful, we have a clip to show you.
Oh dear, this was not my best moment. But at any rate, the first thing I learned was that ratings were everything. And I lasted for 6 months and left and came back to the Post, and it was so relaxing not to sort of have to worry about everything you were writing being judged and numbers and, you know, ratings and all of that. Well, what's changed with the web is that that's the case. Now ratings are everything, and traffic is everything, and how, you know, the most beautiful word in the English language now is going viral. You know, you want your stories to be out there and for people to read them, and so that puts a lot of pressure on reporters and journalists, and it also, I think, it skews the way you look at what you write and how you write it, because what people might want to read in the newspaper, if you're writing just a solid story that you know is a responsible news story that should be in the paper, but you also know that's not going to get a lot of traffic, you may not be as enthusiastic about writing that as you would be something that was, you know, Paris Hilton or
which one of
Kardashians.
your religious columns has gotten the biggest response?
I did a column some months ago about suffering and how nobody gets a pass. We all suffer. And that really seemed to resonate. People really responded to that in a way that I was just stunned. I mean, people stop me on the street and, you know, their eyes well up with tears and they want to tell me their stories. And it was interesting because I was talking to my editor, and, you know, I was talking to him about my own feelings about suffering, and he said, "You've got to write that." And I said, well, you know, at first it wasn't a column. At first, I got the you'll be happy to know the Productive Aging Award from the Center for Jewish Center for something. I can't remember the name of the organization, but it's a very good organization. And so I gave a speech to them. They honored me at this dinner, and I gave a speech, and this was my speech, and I then just cut it back and made it into a column. And
how much of the suffering of your husband's dementia have you written about?
I haven't written about it at all. He was diagnosed a while ago, but it became obvious that that he had a serious problem about 2 years ago. So I began to tell people. I am writing a memoir now for Harper One, and I will write about it a lot in that.
How has that impacted you? And does he know you?
He does know who I am, yes. We actually have called in hospice care this week. And, you know, it's interesting because I thought, oh, well, this is going to be not so hard because Ben is going to be, you know, he'll just gradually lose his memory and he'll ask me to repeat things and then, you know, it'll just be. But it's been the most horrible experience I've ever had up until recently, and he's still at home. I still have him sleeping in the bed with me, and I will until the end. But a certain peace has come over me, and a sort of feeling of serenity because what I thought was going to be horrible, the caretaking part of it, has really become something almost sacred about it, and that's not drivel. I didn't expect that. I just expected I would be having a nervous breakdown and it would be too horrible. But I don't think we have ever been as loving with each other as we are now. And you know, we spend a lot of time together. And we hold hands, and he knows me, and he loves having me there. And it's just extremely rewarding to be able to be there for him now, to try to make him happy and to give him as much love as I can until he dies.
93 years old?
93. He was 93 in August, yeah.
How many years?
41 years we've been together.
41 years.
Yes, and we'll be celebrating our 36th wedding anniversary this October.
When the two of you are going through this period now, what do you both think are were the best moments of your professional life?
Well, obviously, you know, for Ben, Watergate was nothing can compare to that. It was a very stressful time for him, and we got together in the middle of Watergate. And so that was, in fact, that I left the paper because I was in love with Ben, and I knew that there was no way that I could get involved with him while he was going through this, because he was being watched. I mean, the Nixon people had people following him around, and Woodward and Bernstein, and that it would destroy his credibility as a journalist. And so I quit. I took the job at CBS, which I did not want to do, and I didn't want to move to New York. I had a boyfriend in New York, somebody I cared about very much, but by that time I was in love with Ben. But I realized that I had no choice, and so I did quit. And after I quit and moved to New York, I told him that I was in love with him, and we ended up together. And then he immediately left his wife, and their marriage, they had been estranged for several years, and so then it was okay. But there was just too much at stake for us to be together while he was going through Watergate and still married.
So given the fact that you got such a strong reaction out of your column on suffering, what would you tell people about dementia that might help them deal with it?
You know, Sandra Day O'Connor's husband, John, had Alzheimer's, and she actually ended up putting him in a nursing home in Arizona. And everybody has his or her own way of dealing with this, but Sandra was a great friend of my parents, and about a year ago I saw her at a reception, and I said, I want to talk to you, I just want to ask you about this. And we went off in the other room, and she put her hands on my shoulders, and her eyes sort of teared up, and she said, I just want you to know this is really horrible. It's really, really horrible. It's terrible. There's nothing good about it. And I think, what I think is that people need to be realistic about what it is. The first thing you do is to hide it. That's what everybody does. That's what I did. I hid it for years. Oh, Ben's just forgetting his glasses and his keys, you know. And it wasn't until he was speaking in front of a group, he was doing a conversation with John Meacham at this group, in front of a group of CEOs in New York. And he'd had a sort of a blackout the day before. And I said to him that morning, are you okay? Do you think you want to do this? Because we can always cancel it. No, I'm fine. And he got up on the stage with Meacham, and he couldn't answer a question. He didn't know when he'd been in the war. He didn't know when he'd gone to the post. He didn't know when he was... And I was sitting there just dying. I just had a knot in my stomach. And at one point, he just looked absolutely panicked, and he turned to me and he said, Sally, help me out. And I just died.
Did you know he was having trouble with memory then?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you did?
Oh, yeah. No. But I mean, up until that time, he'd been okay. But this blackout really sort of took some of the cognitive, it took its toll on him cognitively. And so it was after that you could see that he was in a decline. I started telling people, because I just couldn't hide it anymore. Because, you know, once you say the A word, everybody's attitude changes toward you. Now, I have to say that our friends have been absolutely extraordinary, and people continue to invite us out to dinner and continue to come to our house for dinner. And I have tried to keep Ben as engaged as possible, because the more he's engaged, the slower it goes. And so he's been part of a men's group, which has been fantastic. 12 guys with Alzheimer's or dementia, where he goes 3 days a week. He had to stop last week. They asked him not to come back. And that's been fabulous. And then I've had people over for dinner 2 or 3 nights a week. And even though he can't participate, he loves being around people. That's all finished. I mean, in the last 6 weeks, he's just had such a decline that he can't participate at all anymore. But you know, I had a birthday party for him in August, and he was able to come downstairs and blow out the candles on the birthday cake. And you know, friends, my son lives in the house right next door, so he comes over, and I moved my office downstairs next to the library so I could be close to him. And so there's been a sort of constant stirring of people coming in and visiting and seeing him. And he was going to the office once a week to have lunch with the guys. And I had a running tab at the Madison so they could all take him over there. And they would talk about the good old days in journalism. And people have just been incredible. They've been so wonderful to Ben and about Ben and to me. And I think that has really kept him going, all of the activity. And so I also think that for people who are to try to keep active, and I think a lot of people just sort of shut down their whole lives. Somebody said to me, someone who was close to Nancy Reagan said that, you know, she just basically shut her whole life down and did nothing but take care of Ronnie. I'm not doing that. I work full time, and I go out with friends for dinner at night. And I have to keep my life going. I try to get as much sleep as I can, although it's difficult because Ben is up a lot at night. But getting enough sleep is absolutely essential, and eating well and exercising. And you can't take care of it. I mean, it's like putting the mask on your face in the airplane before you put it on someone else. You've got to be healthy in order to take care of somebody else. And I find if I get too tired, I begin to get weepy and just not feeling like I can handle it. But I do think that people need to keep on with their lives, have people come over and sit, have a cup of coffee. I mean, you don't have to have a dinner party, but just come over and get a couple of people to come and just have coffee or tea or a drink or something. But just don't shut your life down. I think that's really the problem that so many people have. It's really hard. I mean, nobody should ever believe that it's not easy.
Is he aware of what's going on?
He's, yeah, he knows. Well, I tease him. I say, you know, in my next life, I'm going to be Ben Bradlee. Not just for this, but for other reasons, too. Ben has never been depressed a day in his life, and I've been with him for 41 years, and I've never seen him depressed. And he's just very happy, and he's taken care of. He's got people fluttering around him every minute. You know, he is so well taken care of, and he's really happy, and he likes to be fussed over. So he's very aware of being taken care of and fussed over, and he appreciates that. And he sleeps now about 20 hours a day and doesn't eat much. But you know, he's totally content.
What was television like?
I hated it.
Why?
I absolutely hated it. I love sitting here and talking to you. That's fun. But first of all, the show was from 7 in the morning, so they wanted us to get up at 1:30 and be in the studio so that we could, quote, write the show, which was ridiculous because what we were doing was writing lead-ins to, you know, some film pieces. But they wanted a Washington Post writer to write the show. Hughes was a brilliant writer too. And so, you know, we'd sit there in the morning, and then they'd bring lunch, quote, lunch in at about 3:30, and it was Chinese food.
So why was Hughes Rudd a bad boy?
Oh, I mean, he was just very mischievous and very iconoclastic, and both of us. I mean, we had this cult following because we were both so outrageous on television, and we said things that nobody had ever said before on live TV, and so you know, the CBS suits were just crazed because. You know, because they couldn't believe what was going on. And then today, it would be more, I'll tell you what it was like. It was like the Jon Stewart show. That's really what it was like. there were little touches of sort of Saturday Night Live. So if we had done that show at night, it would have been a huge hit. But it wasn't what people wanted to watch, except some. Our biggest fan was Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol got up in the morning and watched religiously. He loved the show because he was always waiting for one of us to say something outrageous because it was so not conventional. But you know, then getting up in the morning, and then I couldn't write, you know. I mean, but that's what I loved doing, was writing pieces for the Washington Post. And of course, at that point, I was in love with Ben, and Ben and I had already were together, and nobody knew it. So we were meeting quietly, you know. He was flying up to New York and meeting me, and I was exhausted all the time, because then I would see Ben on the weekends, and, you know, my not biological clock, that was a Freudian slip. My, what do you call it, circadian clock?
Circadian rhythms.
Rhythms were off totally, so I was always tired, and I wasn't having any fun. I mean, I loved Hughes, and being with Hughes was wonderful, but then I was getting criticized constantly for what I was doing, and it just reading the news just wasn't what I wanted to do. It wasn't fun.
You're fairly public in these columns about your life. Why do you want to share all this with people, and how does that impact your life when you tell all this?
You know, people ask me that a lot. I'm not a private person.
Well, by the way, what do you think when politicians say they're private people?
Well, it makes me laugh, you know. I mean, I have many close friends who I would consider really private, who just shrink at the idea of any kind of publicity. But for me, it's a way of connecting. It's a way of connecting to people, with people, because I'm sharing what I'm going through, and people respond to that, and I like that. When people say, "Me too," you know, I've been there too. I know what you mean, and I feel like it in some way. People feel helped or reassured because it's generally not boasting, you know, when I write about myself or what's going on. It's more about what's happening in my family. And
well, what about the fallout from that whole thing about the wedding? And
yeah.
Which is a complicated thing to even explain.
Yeah, it's very complicated. Ben's granddaughter was getting married, and at that point there was a sort of a separation in the family of some of us, some of his children, his children, and I were not getting along, and Ben was not getting along with them either. And so we had decided not to go to the wedding, just because we felt it would be too awkward. And at that point, Ben had dementia, and that was part of the problem.
And that was not made public at the time.
Nobody knew that. And so he didn't want to go, and so we regretted. And
well, let me explain that Ben's son, by his first marriage, Ben
Jr.
Bradlee Jr., who was married to Martha Raddatz,
right,
had a daughter, and it was
right,
her wedding.
Yes,
okay.
And we adored her. Greta, we absolutely adored her. She was like my child. I loved her, but because of the situation, it was just it would have been too painful and too complicated, and Ben didn't want to go. But it got out that when my son Quinn was getting married, his fiancée was pregnant, and so we had to move up the wedding date, and we couldn't. The only date we could get at the National Cathedral where they were going to get married was this one date in 3 months that was available, the church and the minister. And so we chose that date and had the wedding invitations made up. And then we found, and I called the members of my family, and I mean other members of Ben's family, and they all said fine, fine, fine. And we started about to send the invitations out when we learned that it was the same date as Ben's granddaughter, who was getting married in California, and there were no overlap in guests. And so then there was this sort of rash of stories about how, you know, this was upsetting to everybody.
And you wrote about it.
Yes, and so we were down in actually St. Martin, and my son and daughter-in-law were there, and there were some really horrible things written on the internet about them. And they had nothing to do with any of this. I mean, it was just one of these awful mistakes, but they were getting criticized. Quinn is very learning disabled, and people were calling him a retard, and it was just awful stuff. And they were distraught and asked me to do something. Perry was pregnant and was actually having a miscarriage at the time. I was distraught. So I called my editors of the Post and said, how can I combat this terrible publicity? I'm just so upset about what's happening with the kids, what they're writing about the kids. And they said, well, why don't you try to write something about it? So I did. And I just said, I don't know whether this is going to work. I had sort of hoped somebody else would write about it. And I wrote this piece, and it was accepted by everybody at the paper, including the managing editor, who said, great piece, wonderful, fine, terrific, and they ran it. And then there was this, this reaction to it. And so when I came back, whoa. But it was a very, very difficult time for me and for Ben, who was extremely agitated because he didn't quite understand. He was very confused about what was happening, and I had shown him the piece, but of course his judgment was not great.
I saw that you really got upset with Howie Kurtz when he wrote a piece. So did Quinn get divorced or separated?
Quinn is in the process of getting divorced. Yeah.
Well, I was surprised that you got so upset with Howie Kurtz, who wrote tell about that piece. You remember?
Oh yeah.
Because he wrote about the divorce, and
he did.
Yeah, but you were upset with him because you knew him at the paper and all that stuff.
Yeah, I wasn't that upset. He wrote a piece that Quinn's wife Perry had posed and some pictures of her, and sort of sexy pictures, nothing pornographic or anything, and put them up on her Facebook page, and how he saw them through a friend's Facebook page, and wrote about it, and it made it sound kind of sleazy. So I just emailed him and said, I'm so disappointed in you. That was it. It was not a big deal.
So the memoir comes out when?
Yes, well, isn't that an interesting question? My due date is a year from this week. And that means I have to write it, Brian.
And so you're right in the middle of the difficulties with your husband. Yeah. On the column, what are some of the columns you want to tackle that you haven't written yet?
Well, I'm writing 2 or 3 pieces right now. One of them is about the Pledge of Allegiance and this drive to get under God taken out. And I agree with that, because it was slapped on there, and in the 50s, and it just had never been in there. So I'm writing a piece about that. I'm doing an interview with Reza. I did an interview at Busboys and Poets, a live interview with Reza Aslan, who wrote Zealot about Jesus. And I just interviewed him yesterday about what ISIS is, and they consider themselves Muslims. But if you ask most Muslims, they would tell you that these people don't represent Islam, but in fact, what the Quran says, it gives you a way to cherry pick it so that you can find a way to make it a peaceful religion or a violent religion, the same as Christianity or Judaism or any other religion. So I'm working on that, and then I'm going to be doing a piece on Sam Harris, who's got a book out now called Waking Up: Spirituality Without Religion, which is very interesting. And then I'm going to be doing an interview with Karen Armstrong about her new book, Violence and Religion.
So, one more time, people want to read your column, they go where?
They Google On Faith, and it'll come right up.